So, welcome to the second Q&A of this retreat. Who would like to get started?
This is kind of a silly question, Delson.
There are no silly questions. That's what you like.
But I was going over the 32 parts of the body this morning, and I only actually counted 31 in that. What's that about?
31, huh? What do you think you're missing?
Yeah, I noticed the brain was not there.
Yeah. Yeah, the brain as a physical organ in today's world could be understood as the mind itself, because a lot of the different faculties that we have of the mind, as discussed in the Dhamma, which is the faculty for contact, the faculty for feeling, the faculty for perception, the faculty for intention, and the faculty for attention. So when you talk about mentality and materiality, there is the materiality of the four great elements that make up this body. And this body, in all its different organs and its different nervous systems and all kinds of different ways of functioning, make up that entire body and mind complex. But that should include the brain as a physical organ, the brain tissue, and so on and so forth. But it's the brain that is connected with the nervous system. And it's through our nervous system that we experience the world. So if you really look at the body, you have the skin and you have the bones, you have the muscles, you have the various organs, you have the heart, you have the lungs, and so on and so forth. But all of these are regulated by the different nervous systems. You have the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and so on. And these different functions of the nervous system in today's modern understanding can be attributed to the Dhamma understanding of the faculties of mentality. So when we talk about, for example, contact, when you have contact, you have the faculty for contact, which is in the mind, and that is rooted through the nervous system. So for example, when you take the eye, you have photoreceptors in the eye, which take in that light. When the light of that form hits the eye, that is contact. Likewise for the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind in this case would be thoughts, internal thoughts. And then you have the faculty for feeling, and that is really sensory experience through the six sense bases. So after you have the contact, for using the example of the eye, where the light hits the eye, that's contact. And then the actual seeing of the form, which is where the nervous system processes that light into some kind of an image in the brain, that is the faculty for feeling, which then provides the process of feeling. It goes even further than that with the faculty for perception. Perception is the ability to see, for example, in front of me, I see a tree. And that tree is, has green leaves, it has branches, and it has a large stalk, and so on and so forth. So discriminating between the green and then the leaves, discriminating between the stalk and the branches and so on, that's perception. That's because the mind has learned through knowledge of what a tree is. And so that perception aspect labels that as a tree, but it can go deeper and say that leaf there belongs to this kind of a tree, and that's the bark of this kind of tree, and so on, based on memory and knowledge. So that faculty for perception occurs through, again, the nervous system, in with the brain being the central hub of the nervous system. So that perception is really taking in what is being experienced in the way of the light hitting the eyes, processing that into an image, and then superimposing upon that the knowledge that that is a tree. And then you have intention. Intention is where formations are basically responsive to the contact that arises. So intention here is that choice that one makes based on that tree. One can choose to think about that tree. One can choose to think about something else related to that tree. One can choose to walk towards that tree to get some shade and all kinds of things. So that intention, again, is rooted in that nervous system of the brain. It's rooted in the mentality factor of intention. So then finally, attention, which is through which consciousness or cognition flows. So when you have attention, you're actually looking at the tree with some form of collectedness and concentration. So it's putting your attention on it. You become mindful of the tree. Mindfulness here being the placing of one's attention towards an object. So I don't think you will find in the suttas anything related to the brain itself, but the equivalent of that will be the faculties of the mind, which in today's understanding, we see it as the nervous system, which provides us these different ways of experiencing the reality around us.
And regarding intention, I think often Bhikkhu Bodhi translates formations as volitional formations. Is that because formations won't be pushed through to all the way to contact, let's say, without intention?
So the way we
is there always intention in order formation?
Yeah. The thing about formations is there is the volitional formations that arise because of intention. So, for example, using the same example of seeing a tree, now that contact of seeing that tree actually already activates certain formations that are rooted in feeling. So there are formations that, the mental formations, for example, that allow one to basically understand through feeling, through sensation, that you are seeing a tree, and then the mental formation of perception of knowing that what you are seeing is a tree. But that's not volitional. That's just contact, then feeling and perception. There is the intention which drives forward a formation that is rooted in, actually, you could say it's actually verbal formations, because you're thinking about it now consciously. So verbal formations provide one expression. Usually it's talked about as vocal expression, where you are talking about the tree, for example, after having seen the tree. But here I would also put expression as the umbrella under which you have the expression of walking towards the tree or walking away from the tree. So that's also related to physical formation. So you're using the body as a way to express how you feel about the tree as well, walking towards it. So all of these are intertwined, but the volitional formations arise based on the choice you make, that is dependent upon the contact. You may even choose not to do anything about it and just keep watching the tree. And therefore, there's only the mental formation of feeling and perception arising. When you do something about that tree in terms of moving towards it, when you have verbal expression towards it, that is dependent upon the contact, feeling, and perception. And then at that point, you make that choice. And then that formation, or those sets of formations that allow you to make that intention and verbalize that intention or physicalize that intention, arises through your faculties of mentality and materiality. So then there's more contact happening. The thing about this is it happens in every microsecond. So when you go back to using the mind and the brain, it's making micro decisions in every moment. And so each of these moments has basically thousands and thousands and thousands of small formations that are always looking at what's going on. And then, for example, in feeling and perception, there's just trillions of formations arising in every moment because there's so much being taken in through contact, let's say. And that contact just doesn't depend upon the eyes. You have 5 other levels of contact. You have the ears, the nose, and so on and so forth. But in nowhere around there is there intention. Intention happens when there is this sense of decision about what is being made contact about. That decision drives forward a consciousness that then is rooted in that mentality, materiality to make that action, whether it's verbal, physical, or thinking about something.
Okay, so when it's said with the cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of formations, that can only be describing volitional formations, because unless you're talking about the cessation of perception and feeling.
So yeah, when you talk about the cessation of ignorance, let's look at ignorance again. So here, ignorance is the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, not understanding suffering as it actually is, not understanding that the cause of suffering is craving and the other conditions, which provides us the knowledge of dependent origination, not understanding or experiencing release, that is experiencing nirodha, cessation of suffering, and not understanding and knowing the path, the Eightfold Path leading to that enlightenment. When you have the cessation of ignorance, formations will still arise. For example, for an arahant, formations continue to arise in the way of mental formations like feeling and perception. There is still volition though. So an arahat can choose to, take the shade of the tree to meditate under. That is still volitional. Here, the formations that are discussed are actually the fettered formations, formations that are fettered by conceit and craving and hindered by ignorance. So these formations are deep seated and deep rooted because of many lifetimes of having conceit, many lifetimes of having craving, many lifetimes of making different choices from a sense of self. So every time we make a choice towards following the Eightfold Path, we are starting to drill away at the formations that are fettered by conceit, the formations that are fettered by craving and fettered by ignorance. So these formations that are fettered are being fettered through the asavas. And when we talk about the asavas give rise to ignorance, but there is also ignorance as part of that set of asavas. And then you have being or becoming or a sense of being. And then you have the asava for sensory craving, sensual craving. So it's like getting into deeper and deeper and deeper layers. So you have fetters, which are what bind one to this samsara, this wheel of samsara, as we were talking about before. And then you have the destruction of the fetters, but these fetters are built up by underlying tendencies. These underlying tendencies being built up by the fettered formations, and these fettered formations being built up by the asavas. So it's like the asavas are like the subatomic particles, if you will, to use an analogy, and the fetters are the manifestation of the asavas.
Thank you.
The subatomic particles can be called kalapas too as well.
Kalapas?
Yeah, kalapas, yeah.
What would you call that in English?
I wouldn't have a clue, but if it's Pali, there'd be a translation somewhere, I'd say.
Yeah.
So the kalapas are even smaller than an atom.
Oh, you're saying it just as a general term for the subatomic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're also known as, in Sanskrit, they're also known as anu, A-N-U, anu, which is like the atom. And I suppose kalapa is below that, subatomic.
Delson, talking about the mind and mind faculties, I read in, again, these are like Burmese texts, so it's a lot of, I think it's Abhidhamma heavy. One thing that I always wanted to know, it's the way they describe it. Mind is, we always think that if it is a mind, then we always point it out to our brain and head, and like it's no, like this is the way we normally think. But in there is saying mind is in the heart, a chamber of the heart. I think it's a Pali word called ayatana. It's something like that. My pronunciations is Pali is terrible. So, is it your understanding too? So probably the faculties are in the mind because of these sensories, but, I don't know how I have to describe it, but is one time I had the cessations experience that it sees it, the very last one is your heart. I don't know, is that true? Like, or I'm always thinking, did I get it right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's when you talk about the mind or mentality, we tend to think about the brain, as we were talking about earlier. But if we understand it from the modern terminology, the brain is just like the central hub. So in that sense, it is the heart of all experience. But the brain also extends throughout this entire body, because the brain being the central hub, the nervous system is the extension of the brain that goes throughout this entire body. So the materiality is even includes the nerves, includes the brain, and so on and so forth. So the materiality includes this entire body, but the mentality also includes this entire body. So it's like having the physical aspect of it, which is the actual, skin, bones, and so on, and then the mental aspect of it, which is experiencing everything within the body and without the body, or outside of the body. Yeah, ayatana really means base or sphere or dimension. So ayatana can be understood as the, salayatana, which means the six spheres of experience, which is really the six sense bases. But sometimes it's also known as the 12 ayatanas, because you have the internal, which is the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and mind. And then you have their objects. So you have the form, you have the sound, you have the odor, you have the taste, you have the touch, and you have thoughts. So these are also bases of experience. Ayatanas are also understood as the arupa jhanas. So ayatanas have to do with when you're at the fourth jhana, when you experience infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothing, and neither perception or non-perception. It's an extension of the fourth jhana. So it's not that it is the fifth jhana, the sixth jhana. We say these as common uses of phrase. We just say that it's the fifth jhana, the sixth jhana, but really it's ayatana. So it's an extension of the fourth jhana. It's going into the arupa experiences, the formless experiences that are rooted in the fourth jhana, or using the fourth jhana as a base. Now, I have heard of people using the word chitta as a way of understanding that heart, mind, or the heart and the mind as well. And there are different understandings of this word chitta. Sometimes, since you referenced the Abhidhamma, and the Abhidhamma, chitta is just this one iota of consciousness. So it's like trillions of chittas happening in a few seconds, and then another way of understanding the chitta is sort of this, it's almost likened to a self. It's almost likened to a soul. But if you go into the suttas, I have not come across anywhere in the suttas talking about chitta in that sense. If you look at chitta, it seems more to be like a mindset. So a mindset being a collection of like-minded thoughts that then provide, and that can be changed based on information and experience. But the heart chamber and things like that, I have had discussions before with people about this. And I know that in yoga, for example, there is this understanding that there is the spiritual heart, there's a spiritual core in which that is sort of the last part of experience before you enter into nirvana or whatever the experience might be. But within sutta literature, I have not come across this understanding. So it could just be all of these are like a mixture of cultural and past spiritual, let's say, perspectives that have been infused in that kind of Buddhism, whether it's Thai Buddhism or Burmese Buddhism or whatever it might be. But you probably will not come across that in the original Pali canon within the suttas regarding the chitta.
The Thais use it interchangeably with heart, mind. So Citra is considered the mind, and the mind is considered the heart. So it's interchangeable. So it's just another cultural perspective on that too as well.
Right.
Probably, yeah.
So, and I believe the spelling in that is C-I-T-T-A. So not with H in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With regards to the 5 aggregates, would mind be a part of body but encompass the other 4 aggregates? Maybe it's a useless exercise to try and make it fit in there.
Yeah, one of the ways I have explained it is that mentality is within materiality, and then materiality is experienced through mentality. So when you look at the 5 aggregates, you have form, which makes up materiality, and then the other 4 aggregates making up mentality. So when you really look at mentality and materiality, nama, rupa, that's where the 5 aggregates can be understood as the 5 aggregates. Of course, there's different ways of being explained in the suttas as faculties and so on and so forth. But the form, as we understand it, is materiality. So it has nothing to do with experience except insofar as providing a route for experience to occur through the body. You have feeling and perception, consciousness and formations. You could say, or you could understand it in this way. You have feeling, which is the experience of feeling that happens through the process of feeling, but as rooted in the faculty of feeling. Likewise for perception. When it comes to formations, you can liken formations to intention, the faculty of intention. But that doesn't mean that it's just volitional formations. It's just, we're saying that in the mentality and materiality, volitional formations do arise through intention. But the aggregate of formations also includes, as we talked about earlier, mental formations where there's just pure feeling and perception without any self there, without any intention there. And in consciousness can be rooted with attention being a vehicle for consciousness to flow through along with intention. So, the four aggregates are related to, in that sense, mentality. And then the first aggregate of form is related to materiality.
And mind is contained in both.
That's right. Mind, when you look at the mind is a way of understanding definitely the faculties of mentality, but mind also includes the links of dependent origination. So the analogy that I have used before is the 5 aggregates are like the riverbed, and it's just the bottom of the river. And then the flow of dependent origination is like the river. It's constantly flowing. You have the links of dependent origination constantly flowing. And then what gets picked up in the way of the riverbed makes up the aggregates. And so the aggregates are always changing based on feeling and the different experiences of feeling that you have, based on perception and the different perceptions that you have. Likewise for formations and consciousness. And that in fact includes the form. Form is always changing. Even at this point in time, there's a lot of different things going on with form in relation to the body, but forms also includes external forms. So when the Buddha talks about the 5 aggregates, he's also referring to feelings related to the external world, feelings related to the internal mentality, perceptions of the outside world, and perceptions related to inside, meaning the mentality. Likewise for the other formations. He also refers to these different aggregates in relation to the past, the future, and the present, near and far, and so on and so forth. So the aggregates are not just in terms of personal experience, so to speak. It's not just about how one experiences the world, but it's also in relation to how one experiences the world, in relation to having a memory of the past. That aggregate of the past is linked to that past memory, but it is impermanent. As soon as you think about something else, it's gone, whether it's form, whether it's feeling, perception, consciousness, or formations. When you think about something that is, half a world away, you're thinking about forms, or you're thinking about feelings that are rooted in that experience that's, half a world away, that's far away or near, and so on and so forth. So aggregates are, yes, mental or related to mind, but they're also related to how one experiences the world at large. So that's why form is not just the body, but form is also, this computer that I'm using, the webcam I'm using, the tea I'm drinking, or the teacup I'm drinking from. It's related to the tree I'm seeing, and so on and so forth. All forms in that case are aggregates of form.
Okay. So with the river analogy, could it be said that since dependent origination occurs through the mind or within the mind, the water is the mind, but also the riverbed is the mind in constant change in terms of internal aggregates?
Yes, you could say that that's the case. Now we're talking about dependent origination on the micro level. On the macro level, the five aggregates are dissolved in relation to the mentality and materiality. But what happens is at the level of dissolution of the aggregates, because they're using the example of this, because there might be craving still present, that craving acts like a glue. So it sticks the intention driving forward consciousness to a formation. And that formation that arises is related to something related to the past that one has experienced in this lifetime before they dissolve, so to speak, or related to something that they think about that, may I be in the realms of the devas, or may I be born in so and so, or maybe their formations are related to their jhanic practices and they become attached to certain jhanas. And so they go and become born or reborn in the realm related to that jhana. So when the craving arises, because of seeing that as personal, the consciousness drives forward, and that intention drives forward that consciousness. When it gets planted into the new mentality or the new mentality materiality, then that consciousness dissipates and there arises a new consciousness, and there is still a new arising and passing away of consciousness. The reason why I'm talking about this is because, yes, you want to understand it from the level of dependent origination that happens in every moment in one lifetime, but you don't want to limit it to just the five aggregates in this one lifetime. So dependent origination does flow through this riverbed of the mind, the river and the mind, but it also flows beyond that in relation to craving, in relation to taking something personal, in relation to the formations, which can give rise to a new rebirth in another lifetime. And so it's not limited to the five aggregates in this lifetime, because remember, the five aggregates are constantly changing, as we just mentioned. So, which means the mind is constantly changing as well. And the last dissolution of the aggregates is at that point of death. But the same aggregates that you have, let's say in that example, at death, is not the same set of aggregates that you had a few moments before that death. It was still constantly changing. So it's not limited to just the aggregates, but for this understanding within the micro level, it flows through the experience of the aggregates, which are always changing.
Mr. Guru, there's one question. Like we always radiate the loving kindness or the compassion to the world, to all beings. So how can we see this um, radiation, this vibration effect on the dependent origination?
Yes.
So how it goes to affect the other person under this dependent origination?
Yeah. So when you send out loving kindness, when you send out compassion, first and foremost, in terms of dependent origination for one's own experience, you are developing formations because you have made a choice to cultivate loving kindness. You have made a choice or the intention to generate compassion for yourself and for others. So because of those formations, a lot of the actions that you take, a lot of the things that you might say, and a lot of the things that you will think about will be rooted in those formations. So next time you go and see that person, you will respond to that person in a different way because you have that genuine, natural loving kindness for them, that genuine, natural compassion for them. But it does not affect them in their ability to experience dependent origination, meaning it will only affect them insofar as how you respond to them with loving kindness and compassion. So if I meet somebody and I send them loving kindness and compassion, my responses to them and the way I behave with them will be rooted in that loving kindness and compassion. Because of that, in their own experience, they will have a contact that is wholesome. They will hear pleasing words. They will hear, words of encouragement, and they will just have the sense that this person has goodwill towards me, has benevolence towards me. And so because of that contact with that experience, those formations that arise help one to have an intention that is also rooted in reciprocating that loving kindness more often than not. If a person is just, begrudgingly upset and does not want to accept your loving kindness, that's their karma, that's their intention. And they might just be stubborn and say, you know what, I don't want your loving kindness. I don't want your compassion. That's their choice. That's their karma. And that's their intention. So, but more often than not, people will be open and receptive to it. And because of that, their formations that arise will be wholesome and their intention will be wholesome. And then their reciprocation through their expression of their mind, their thoughts, their speech, and their body in terms of how they have their body posture, how their breathing is, and so on, will be related to the loving kindness, will be related to that compassion. Now, when you talk about sending out loving kindness and compassion to beings, let's say, across the universe, it's not just, let's say, you're having face-to-face, but it's somebody halfway around the world. You think about them and you send them loving kindness and you send them compassion. It may be that your compassion, your loving kindness is so strong that it actually helps them to think in a different way. And they might be receptive to that and then feel like they feel good about it. They feel good in that moment because of that loving kindness or that compassion. And that contact of feeling good internally will give rise to wholesome formations. And in the same way, it will allow them to have a wholesome intention.
So that means that, well, I really the loving kindness, there is no distance, and they don't need any physical contact, and then they can have the perceptions of the loving kindness of what I'm sending.
Yes.
I do have experience that when I really radiate the loving kindness, they change.
Yes.
By having a different emotion.
Yes.
So that's what I'm thinking. Even you set the bed and then the consciousness flow actually is merged into a one pool. It's not just individual, I believe. Because if I create something that without contact, without physical contact, then I can give it to you. So even this flow, the dependent origination, the life pattern is also influenced the other set of the dependent origination.
Yes.
So it is like a pool.
Yeah,
I don't know.
more than a pool, it's like layers. So you have different origination on the individual experience, let's say, on the personal experience. But if you think about it in a way where you have karma is, you could call it a karmic field in that case, which is always changing. So the way one responds and the way one reacts and so on is constantly changing this field of karma. So that pool that you're referring to, when you think about it, is really karma. It's just all of this karma that then solidifies sometimes into the experience that you're having in this world. Or if your karma is even more wholesome and brighter, you have a karma that has to do with the deva realms and higher realms and so on. But if your karma is, let's say, unwholesome and darker in that sense, then you're solidifying that karma to go into the hell realms, into the animal realms and the asura realms. So when we talk about the planes of existence that make up samsara, what you're talking about there in terms of that field or that pool is that whole experience of samsara. That's like the largest aspect of it, that all the dimensions and wavelengths and all of the spheres of existence are related to this samsara.
You know, before I'm thinking like the different realm, it is like we are in the human realm, and then we have different level of different realm. But when I meditate, I just feel it's in the same dimension.
Yeah.
You can just click and then it's there. Even the ghost realm and all the realm is here. There's
Yeah.
no distance and there's no time, and it's just here. Am I right or not?
Yes, you can experience it like when you see, when you talk about the different levels, when you talk about the Deva realms and the Brahma realms and, you know, all the realms above, and then you talk about the realms below, it's just a way of understanding that somehow the notion of higher is related to positivity and the notion of lower is related to negativity. But think about it in this way. You can experience the Deva realms in your mentality without having to physically go there, let's say, so to speak. So in your meditation practice, for example, there is something known as the mind-made body. That's basically another way of talking about astral projection. So you go through a process in the mentality where you can experience the Deva realms and the Brahma realms, you can experience the hell realms and so on while you're just sitting in meditation. So when you see what you see now in terms of all of existence on this planet, your experience that you're having right now is related to because you can only hear certain frequencies. You can only see at certain wavelengths of light. You can only taste and smell certain odors related to those frequencies and molecules. And then in terms of your thinking as well, that's related to certain frequencies in the brain. You have different brainwave patterns and so on. When you go into jhana practice, you can actually start to expand the wavelengths. This is why it's talked about how when the monks started developing, let's say, their psychic powers, or the monks started developing their ability to see the devas, at first, all one sees is light. You know, one doesn't really see any kind of form yet. So the mind, in terms of the eye faculty, the psychic eye faculty, is starting to expand its wavelength of light. So you're starting to see beyond, let's say, ultraviolet or infrared or all the other different kinds of wavelengths that we understand in modern physics. And then little by little, you're starting to see the form of that light, and you're starting to see the devas, for example. So in one way, you can say it's all happening on one plane, but it's like light, right? It's just using that light, and that light has 7 different colors. In the same way, it's all one wavelength or one experience, but there are different spectrum. It's a spectrum of different experiences within that.
When I do the 6R, it's during the release step. Not the pay attention to the content of the talk, but how does I do that this one?
So you're talking about when you have the release step in the 6R process. The release step really is you have, let's say, the mind makes contact with the hindrances. So you're meditating, and for a little while, the mind becomes collected, and then somehow there's another thought about something else. it could be one of the 5 hindrances that arises. The mind might feel sleepy, or the mind is too restless. There might be too many thoughts, or you hear something and now the mind becomes swayed by that. So now when you recognize, so the first R, when you recognize that the mind became swayed away from its object, that's recognition. The release is, for now, your awareness has swayed to that distraction. It has swayed to making contact with that hindrance. The release is releasing that awareness of that distraction and bringing that awareness back to the mind and body. Because once you bring that attention, releasing it away from distraction and bring it back to the mind and body, then you consciously relax by letting go of the tension in the mind and body, and then the rest of the process of the 6 R's.
Another one is that tension is always located in the mind, head, or sometimes it's a feel the body, some part of body, only head.
No, it's not only head. It can arise actually anywhere in the body. So sometimes people experience tension in the shoulders, because they're trying too hard, or in the neck. Sometimes they might experience tension in their joints, wherever it might be. And in terms of the head, it can be experienced as sort of like the beginning of a headache, or like, maybe your sinuses are inflamed, and so you feel like the stuffiness. So the tension can be experienced anywhere within the head or anywhere within the body. That's why one refers to the release step as putting your awareness back on the mind and body both. So that first and foremost, when you do that, you're exercising mindfulness of body and mind. You're exercising the foundations of mindfulness as we understand them from the 4 foundations of mindfulness, from the Satipatthana Sutta. When you do that, then you notice the tension as a manifestation of that hindrance, or as a manifestation of that craving. When you notice it as tension and you consciously make that intention to relax, you don't think relax, you don't say relax, you just let go of it and watch it and feel it dissipate and relax and disappear. Then that's how you let go of that tension. So it can happen in the body, or it could happen in the mind, or it could happen in both as well.
Thank you.
As far as psychic abilities go, what's your impression of people that are psychics? You might watch, years ago, I watched a documentary series on how people went back and found people that had been murdered before. It was a New Zealand show, apparently, and they virtually backtracked. They went to a psychic, the detectives and that, and went back. So my thoughts are this: would these people have been Suttavādas in a previous life that have come back with these skills now?
Not necessarily. You see, the thing is, psychic abilities can be developed outside of the Dhamma as well. So you have, for example, yogis who are, their tradition is rooted in, let's say, Hinduism or Brahmanism, but they're still able to develop these kind of psychic abilities, like remote viewing. You're able to see outside of this vicinity and be able to see that there's a dead body here, for example, or you find a missing person here, or wherever it might be. This is not dependent upon becoming a noble one. So it's not dependent upon becoming a Sotapanna, or entering the stream, or knowing intellectually the Dhamma. It's more dependent upon the faculties themselves. So any of the psychic faculties that are discussed, except with the exception of the destruction of the taints being the higher or the highest form of psychic power, so to speak, with the exception of that, all the other psychic powers can be experienced outside of the Dhamma. So for example, we have the threefold knowledge, right? So in the threefold knowledge, you have the ability to look back into past lives. Then the second full knowledge, being able to see karma, or being able to see other beings through the divine eye, and so on and so forth. This can happen even outside of someone who is a Dhamma follower. So, but the destruction of the taints, understanding the Four Noble Truths, and then having destroyed the taints, is the signature, let's say, of the Dhamma. It's the signature of Buddhism. So an Arhat, you will not find an Arhat outside of the Dhamma. Someone who doesn't know the Eightfold Path, someone who doesn't know the Four Noble Truths, cannot be an Arhat. So with that exception, all of the other psychic abilities that we talk about within the suttas can be experienced without following the Dhamma.
Another thing, as far as not near-death experiences, but for a person to actually pass away, be declared dead and then come back, okay, revived, and the experience, and this happened to me when I was 14. I was in a coma for 10 days and I was declared dead, and I was miraculously come back after I was revived. I was dead for 5 to 7 minutes. They say without oxygen for 3 minutes, there's brain damage and all that. Obviously, there might have been some brain damage, I don't know, but anyway. As far as that goes, my experience with that was, you spoke about that white light before. Okay, so there was a brightness there, and I heard a voice say to me, probably my grandfather, I'd say, even though he died while I was very young, 5 or whatever, but saying to me, it's not your time. Now, I've spoken to someone else, okay, an elderly person, her nurse, and the nurse said to me, what was your experience? What happened? And I told her about that. All right, it's not your time. And she had exactly the same, the words were exactly the same. It's not your time. So consequently, she didn't die and I didn't die, but you know what I mean? So that's just, when you mentioned about the light, that just made, it aroused something in me then about the light, that's all.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
yeah, I would explain it because I know people also who have had, let's say, near-death experiences, or who have been declared medically dead and so on.
yeah.
The thing is, there is all of these different levels of being dead. And what I mean by that is there's the medical sense of death, there's the legal sense of death, you're brain dead and all of these other things. But the experiences are beyond the physical. So the experience, even if you feel like you are floating above the body, or your body is floating, or you have the experience of light and so on, it's beyond the physical. So it's beyond the materiality. So, a lot of times people might think the formations, yes, the formations can be likened to synapses in the brain and the synapses firing and things like that. But a person can be declared dead through having brain death, but still have the experience beyond that, where they're having the white light, or there is a relative that is telling them something. Now, I can tell you personally, my grandfather, before he passed away, about 3 or 4 days before he passed away, he apparently saw a person in the hospital room, and they said, everything is going to be all right, don't worry. And he thought it was a nurse. And he told the other nurses that, I saw this nurse, and she said, everything is going to be okay. And have you seen her before? And they said, no, we never saw her before. We don't know who you're talking about. And so, he was starting to experience things beyond the physical. He was starting to see, let's say, devas or spirits or whatever you want to call them, And so once you start to have these are really karmic experiences or signatures of karma. It's like they determine in some ways where your next life could be. So if you have an experience of light, if you have an experience of angelic beings, it is a determinant of you experiencing the Deva realms, or if people are having fear and are afraid and start to see other kinds of beings, that are, ugly or whatever it might be, then that that person is starting to get bound towards the hell realms or an animal realm or whatever it might be. So these are all things we hear about through, and then of course you yourself have experienced it, so you know it firsthand, what it feels like. But talking to people who have had near-death experiences or people who have died a few days before they passed away, having these kind of experiences shows that there's something karmic going on in the way of how the formations are arising. And that's why it's very important to say that the formations just don't happen through that consciousness in the mind, but there is this sense of the formations happening outside of the body, outside of the mind and body complex. And that's really the macro level of dependent origination. That's where we get into dependent origination related to rebirth from one lifetime and making the switch into another lifetime.
Thanks for the explanation.
Delson, this is really just a curiosity, but since we're talking about the 5 aggregates and mind earlier, I have a friend who was, we were discussing Parinibbana, and he's come across, he says in the suttas, he's come across talk of the 5 aggregates dissolving at death. However, the mind somehow continuing on, like as if the mind were the flame of a fire dependent on logs, the 5 aggregates. But once the logs are gone, the flame somehow continues. Have you come across that in the suttas or in other traditions?
So you're talking about how there's still a mental experience going on beyond the dissolution of, let's say, the form or the 5 aggregates. Yeah. This is again going back to that part of the mind, or let's say part of the macro level of dependent origination, where once the formations have been experienced, so if somebody has happiness in their mind and is having some kind of identification with that happiness or joy, whatever it might be, those formations carry forward what is the, in one way the suttas talk about it as the evolving consciousness. It's the kind of consciousness that arises at the point of death, carried forward through those formations, carried forward through those experiences. And they might feel like they're mental experiences, but this is going beyond the scope of the mind and body. And there is some kind of experience going on. And then that, when it goes into the next birth, goes into the next life, that formation is carrying forward the consciousness, which then takes root into that new mentality. So that interim period, right? It feels like, you have other traditions which talk about, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about bardos and they talk about different levels of bardo. Like you go through different levels of how the consciousness experiences the different realms before it takes rebirth into a new existence. But within the context of Sutra literature, the understanding is that rebirth happens spontaneously. So that occurrence of feeling of time that happens, or that experience of the physical senses, or one experiencing light, or one experiencing different beings, all of that is happening in the span of literally no time. So it's something where it's outside the scope of how we experience time. but it's still happening spontaneously. So in that interim period between one life and the next life, that experience might feel like it's happening for many days, or it might feel like it's happening for many years, or it might just happen for just a split second. But that's the interesting thing about formations, is they're like pockets of experience. Each formation is some kind of pocket of experience. And you can think about it even in the sense of how you experience time now. We talk about the relativity of time, for example. When you're having a good time, when you're really enjoying yourself, time seems to go faster. It feels like as if, there was no time at all. Like when you have a really good meditation, sit, you close your eyes, and all of a sudden, an hour has passed and you feel like it was just a few minutes. And then when you're really struggling, you feel like you've been meditating for like half an hour and it's just been 3 minutes. And so that's the pockets of experience that are rooted in those formations.
And what about in the case of parinibbana, where there will be no rebirth?
Yeah. So in parinibbana, you have the experience of.
Then these.
Go ahead.
Is there any? Oh no, I think you get the gist of my question. Just, is there anything that continues on in some way, like a flame without the substrate of logs?
Yeah, so there's actually a story in the suttas about this. There is a monk named Vakali, and Vakali is very sick in the sutta. He's very ill, and he decides to take his own life. Now that's a separate discussion, because it's going into the realm of suicide and all of that other stuff. But we can talk about that. Just let's first focus on this part. So in the story of Vakali, he says to the Buddha that, I'm paraphrasing here. So there's a lot of details in that sutta. I mean, he talks about, I want to see the Buddha before I pass away. And the Buddha says, don't look at this body as the Buddha. When you see the Dhamma, you see the Buddha in that sense. So anyone who knows me knows the Dhamma, he says, something like that. So anyway, Vakali takes the knife. That's the phrase that they use. He takes the knife, meaning he, kills himself. Basically, he slits his wrist or his throat or whatever it might be. And the Buddha understood that Vakali was on the verge of arahatship. So after having a discourse from the Buddha, after having recognized the Dhamma through the process of dependent origination, he then goes up onto a cliff and takes his own life. And in the sutta, it says that they saw black smoke arising out after he passed, or after the dissolution of his body, after he was gone. And the Buddha said that black smoke is Mara, looking for the consciousness of Vakali so that he can take rebirth into a new life. But he could find no consciousness of Vakali. So in other words, in parinibbana, because no craving is present in the mind of an arahant, because there is no conceit, because there are no fetters, there's no underlying tendencies, all has been eradicated. No new consciousness, that evolving consciousness, which attaches itself to a formation through craving, conceit, or ignorance, is arisen. So when the 5 aggregates dissolve, they dissolve. There's no new consciousness that arises beyond that. So that's the finality, that's the end, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, but Guru, when we watch the movie Matrix, they can put another consciousness onto you do you think that the future science, the neuroscience, we really can plug in something into the different concepts or something?
Yeah, I know right now they're working on things which is known as BCI, brain computer interface. And what it does is it connects the brain with the computer, and you can actually control the computer with your intention. So if you want the cursor on your computer to go from right to left, you can just think about it and it does so. So of course, this is speculating if something like that happens in the Matrix, and something like that could happen. But that is something to reflect on, because when you talk about the experiences that arise through virtual reality, and if this virtual reality happens through, let's say, the brain-computer interface, you're still having fragments of consciousness. You're still having vijnana. Remember, vijnana means jnana, which is cognition, and vi, which is divided. You're still having consciousness dependent upon what is being experienced. So it won't be the same consciousness that is, let's say, plugged into the matrix. It's just that consciousness has the experience of being plugged into the matrix, and then you have another consciousness that experiences the matrix, and so on and so forth. So we've had quite an interesting discussion today, a lot of interesting topics. Do you have more questions? You want to continue?
I listen. The consciousness and mindfulness, how different?
Yeah, consciousness and mindfulness. So consciousness is, you can experience it as a element of the mind, and mindfulness being the placing that consciousness on something. So when we talked about mindfulness in regards to attention, mindfulness is placing that attention. So you're using mindfulness as a process of placing that attention. When that attention is on, for example, when I use the tree in front of me, my attention is now on that tree. So now I am mindful. I've used mindfulness to place my attention on that tree. My consciousness is the experience of that tree. It's the joining of that tree, the light, the form, and the meeting of my photoreceptors, of my eyes. And the meeting of that is the consciousness, which is having experience dependent upon seeing that tree. Now, if my eye goes away from that tree and now I come to see the screen, now I have used mindfulness to place my attention on the screen. A new consciousness has emerged because now there is new contact. That new contact brings about a new feeling of seeing the screen. And that consciousness, which gives light to that experience, when I say gives light, meaning it allows one to have that experience, that consciousness is dependent upon now me seeing that screen.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess we can share some merit now.
May sufferings once be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving share all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisitions of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share these merits of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sādhu, Sādhu, Sādhu.